العالمين. الحمد لله رب العالمين، الصلاة والسلام على رسوله الكريم وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. أما بعد. Inshallah, today we'll try to discuss a topic that's very closely related to the present pandemic situation. So here is the title, The Calamity is it blessing or punishment from Allah, and what should be our response as Muslims? And under this title we'll try to understand the Islamic perspective on trial and punishment when something tough or problematic happens, which way we should look into that, and what should be our response and duties under that circumstances. Okay, so if anybody has a question, I think you can note it down, and at the end of the talk we'll have some Q&A session. And if I get disconnected or something, if you don't find me not seeing that, you can just send me a text in my cell phone that's very close to me. Okay, here's the outline of the talk. First I will go through the concept of trial and punishment. Then I will go through the concept of infectious disease in Islam, that how Islam look into that, and what are the rulings. And at the end of the talk I will go through what should be our duties during this time of trial, from a spiritual perspective and from realistic materialistic perspective. Okay, so let us start with the first thing, the trial and punishment. The verse in the Quran that's very directly talking about trial, there are many other verses, but this verse is Surah Baqarah, the second chapter of the Quran, verse number 155. That's the most straightforward verse talking about the trial. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, وَلَنَبْلُوَنَّكُمْ بِشَيْءٍ مِّنَ الْخَوْفِ وَالْجُوعِ وَنَقْصٍ مِّنَ الْأَمْوَالِ وَالْأَنفُسِ وَالثَّمَرَاتِ وَبَشِّرِ الصَّابِرِينَ. There are a couple of verses that follow these, and before these that's very interesting. I'll suggest the young people to memorize this verse. I mean, a lot of time in your life this verse will be a source of inspiration. So here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is describing one of his rules or sunnah, that he will try human being, all of us, each and every individual of us, with something of fear and hunger, min al khawfi al ju'i, and fear of loss of wealth, excuse me, lives and crops. So this actually mean that people will have tough time, that will comes through, let's say, losing his job, losing his income, sometimes the loss in business, and then also loss of lives. That means death of somebody near to you, sickness, and also loss of crops, right? That's the scarcity of food, and so on and so on. So this is part of the test that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has designed for human being. But the underlying root cause and the root goal is وَبَشِّرِ الصَّابِرِينَ, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants to see that who are the people, they do sabr, they remain steadfast, they trust on Allah and does not panic and react abruptly. So that's the goal of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this verse is saying us that a lot of problematic time, tough time, musibat that we find in our life is actually distribution that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created to test us. And there is a rule that there will be some good time, and that will be followed by some bad time, and that will be again followed by some good time. These ups and downs in life, that's a part of the nature, and that part of the rule by which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala governed this world. And there is a very interesting verse in Quran. This is in Surah Al Imran, the chapter after Baqarah, verse number 140. This verse was revealed after the battle of Uhud, where the Muslim army faced a defeat at the beginning by the army from the Makkah, the Quraysh army. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying a very interesting thing. He's saying that if a wound has touched you, be sure a similar wound has touched the others. And so are the days, that some days are good and some days are not so good, and we give to human being these by terms. So these are the up and down. Sometimes you get good thing and sometimes your enemy get good thing. Sometimes you go up and sometimes your enemy go up. And one of the weightage of this verse, that this verse is actually comparing the Muslim army to the non-Muslim Quraysh army. And we know that those two are not equal. Right? We know for sure that one of the army was under the rahmah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and other one was not. But despite of that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that these ups and downs of the time sometimes are equally applicable to both of you. So that actually shows that how powerful this law is. That it doesn't matter what's your status of the taqwa, that sometimes you will be tested by the down of your time. And sometimes your enemy will be given the ups of the time, even though they're not a very good Muslim. So taqwa is not playing a very important role here for most of the time. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has the other rules, so all of the rules works in conjunction with each other, and you will get a harmony. But this is one part of the rule, that there is ups and downs. So when we try to understand the trial that we are going, and if we know that these ups and downs is there by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then it will help us to understand that how the things are going. Then another point, that these trials are also related for the mu'min to the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And there are a lot of hadith that relates this way, and I have quoted here two of those. In one hadith, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Rasulullah is saying that if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves people, here means a group of people, a community, He tries them, He gives them trial, He tests them. And whoever has patience will have patience, and whoever is anxious will be anxious. And in another hadith, Rasulullah said that the extent of the reward will be in accordance with the extent of the trial. So the trial is actually not a punishment. It's just that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves somebody, and then He gives them some tough time, and see that whether they tackle the tough time with patience. And if they tackle the tough time with patience, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala elevate their status. So that's one of the underlying reasons. So that's the way we should think. Then there is another concept, that's actually the concept of punishments, that when a musibat comes, that also comes due to our wrongdoing, due to our sins that we have done. And there are a couple of verses in the Quran, not just only one verses. There are a couple of verses that actually support each other to a comprehensive understanding. One of them is in Surah Nisa 79, the verse number. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that مَا أَصَابَكَ مِنْ حَسَنَةٍ فَمِنَ اللَّهِ. When you get something that is hasana, that is good, that's from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So فَمِنَ اللَّهِ, from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, means that you do not deserve it. It is by the rahmah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then وَمَا أَصَابَكَ مِنْ سَيِّئَةٍ, and when something comes to you that is evil, that is bad, فَمِنَ النَّفْسِكَ, that's from your own nafs, from yourself. So that means that those bad is actually due to your own responsibility of your own work. This is the consequence of your own work. And in another verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses even a little bit more straightforward wording. he says that وَمَا أَصَابَكُم مِّن مُصِيبَةٍ فَبِمَا كَسَبَتْ أَيْدِيكُم. Whatever musibat you find yourself in, it is what your hands have earned. فَبِمَا كَسَبَتْ أَيْدِيكُم. That is the earning by your hands. So now by your hands, that actually may have two meanings. One, it's just a materialistic consequence that you're doing a bad thing and other people are suffering from that. So let's say that you're distracting the harmony of the nature and then you're getting a natural disaster. So that's the direct consequence, the materialistic natural consequence of what you are doing. And in other way, this is also spiritual, that you are doing sin, moral sin, not following the rules of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and as a consequence of that sin, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving punishment to you, to the human being. So this is not the trial. This is actually the consequence of the actions of human being, both Muslims and non-Muslims. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a policy. He says that وَيَعْفُو عَنْ كَثِيرٍ. That's the last couple of words of this verse of the Quran. This is in Surah Shura, the 42 chapter. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala pardons a lot. So that means that all the sins are not punished. All the wrong things are not converted into the consequence of the punishment. Rather than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgives a lot of them. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives punishment for just a small part of the sins that human being is doing. And another sunnah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is that that this punishment due to the sin of the human being is always not just a straightforward consequence of the sin. Rather than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives a specified time, and there is a pick and choose. So every sins are not punished. Here is a verse in Surah Fatir. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that if Allah were to impose blame on the people for what they have earned, He would not leave upon the earth any creature. So this means that if every wrong, every sin of human being were punished according to the proportion of the sin and immediately, then there would not leave upon the earth any creature. Everybody would be destroyed. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not do that. That is his policy, because He is Rahman Rahim. What Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does, one thing, He pardoned a lot of them, and then He said, but He defers them for a specified time. Right? It's not just an immediate step. And this time can be that for some people this will be in the akhirat, not in the dunya at all. And for some people this can be in the dunya, but not an immediate punishment of their sin. So there might be two explanations of that. So that actually means that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a pick and choose process. And this is why we see that a lot of problematic things going unpunished in this world. And it's very hard to make one-to-one correspondings to the wrongdoings done by individual people and also the big nations, powerful players in the world. But this pick and choose of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is actually not random. There is a wisdom, there is a rule, there is a way He does that. All of that we do not understand, but we understand two things. One, that some of the musibat are due to the sin of the human being, and we also understand that all of the sins are not going to be punished. Some of them actually goes unpunished. This is because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala pardons, and this is because He has a time limit. He has a way to work on that. And some of the sins actually will be gone hereafter, and people will be punished there. Okay, so now the problem that when we have something wrong, this can be a trial, this can be a punishment, and there is no way to clearly distinguish between that whether this is a trial for me, or this is a punishment for me, or this is a trial or punishment for the whole human being. So for example, what's happening now, this pandemic that's going on All the nations are suffering, both the Muslim nations, non-Muslim nations, very powerful countries, and also very least developed countries. So everybody under that. Now it's very hard to make a comment or conclusion that whether this is a trial for us or this is a punishment for us. And one of the reasons we cannot do that, because we do not have any tools of doing that, and from historical experience we see that a very good Muslim community can be under tough trial, tough musibah, tough time, right? One of the example, even during the time of Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, there was drought, and Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam had to pray for rain after that. We find out that during the time of Khulafa Rashida, for example, the second Caliph of Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu ta'ala an, there was a very big famine in the Arab Peninsula. Right, and there was plague in Syria when Abu Ubaidah ibn Zarrah, radiallahu ta'ala an, he was the commander-in-chief there. So Syria was under his ruling, and there was plague in there. He was a very, very high level of Sahaba. On the other hand, we also see that in the history, many times there are many sinful nations, and that actually goes unpunished. And for example, I saw interesting news a couple of months before. Maybe this is some of the Christian groups they did. They make an index that was the most sinful city in America. So these are most probably they have the 7 or 10, I think, the deadly sin in Torah or something like that. So they prepared a parameter based on that and categorized that was the most sinful city. Now, you'll find out that you cannot make a one-to-one connection that the most sinful city will be most punished city by natural disaster. So it's not happened that way all the time. So this is one of the reasons that without any divine knowledge, there is no way to distinguish what is a trial from what is a punishment, and also what is a specific punishment from what is just the usual natural disaster. Without any intention of trial and punishment. So that's the bottom line. Now, there is a Muslim psyche and Muslim mind that most of the time you will find out that a lot of our people, from the common people and also from our respected ulama, that they make a very quick comment that this is a punishment for such and such, or this is such and such. But actually this type of comment is very hard to make within Islam. So we should be very careful with that. The interesting thing in Islam is that we actually do not need this distinction, that whether this is a trial or punishment, because if we look into to-do list, that what should be our response, then without any explicit distinction, we can identify that we have to do the same thing. If it is a trial, we have to do the same thing. If it is a punishment, we have to do the same thing. And that is that we should connect even the trial, doesn't matter if it's a punishment or not, even the trial, we should connect that to our sins, we should rectify ourselves, and we should seek forgiveness to Allah. Because none of us is beyond sin, is above sin, right? All of us has limitations. We have major sins, we have minor sins, we have problem in the perfection of our ibadah, in our duty as the abd of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's why our duties is connecting this tough time, whether it's a trial or punishment, doesn't matter, to our sins. And we should rectify ourselves and we should seek forgiveness to Allah. So that's the sunnah of the Sahaba and the next generation excuse me, people when they face a tough time. And another important thing, that if we can address this tough time, doesn't matter whether trial or punishment, with patience, and if we move to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala a step more, because when I rectify myself and I seek forgiveness to Allah and I become more serious in my ibadah, that's actually a step more ahead to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then the end is always good. Then the end is always good. So when this tough time will end, I actually will earn something from there. I have nothing to lose if I believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and if I become patient to that. And this is one of the reasons why some of the scholars actually say that nothing is punishment to mu'min. Everything is trial to mu'min. Because even if it comes due to our sin, but if we address that by seeking forgiveness and tawbah to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and with patience, then at the end of the day, our sin will be forgiven and our status will be higher. So the end game is always to win for a moment. So that's why when you look from a to-do list, then we actually do not need the distinction whether this is a trial or punishment. Rather than we just treat all the musibat in the same way. And this is why our scholars actually spend a lot of time trying to extract the benefits that's coming from trials and tribulations. And they have tabulated lots of them. I have quoted here some of them. So when you have trials and tribulation, that makes a person recall the sins that he has committed. So that's a reminder, right? You can just see your face in the mirror, and that help you to repentance and reform. Then the second thing, that it makes our heart soft and submitting to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is part of the human nature, that if a person who never faces hardship may become arrogant and cold-hearted. And that is true. A lot of human being actually likes that. And then the trials and tribulation makes a person realize that he cannot rely solely on himself or even others. And he can actually rely on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. And He is the only true source of help and assistance. And this is true, especially for the modern people, right? I mean, if you look into human history, people was not more powerful than this time, right? We have a lot of modern tools. Now we can live a life without depending on others, right? If you stay in your apartment, you get everything. I mean, a lot of the time of the human history was not like that. And this type of capacity actually gives us some confidence that I quote unquote say that this is a deceptive modern confidence, right? That we think that we are not dependent on anything else. We are so powerful. Now that's the problem. If I use a non-religious language and say that if nature create trouble, right, then sometimes it may be so tough trouble that human being cannot deal with that. And this present pandemic is an example that it is just a very simple virus. You cannot see that this is so small, but that actually creating so big a problem to all the human beings, all the nations in the world, and they are undone. They don't know what to do. And this is actually showing that, right? And if we use a religious language, then we will say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is showing us that the confidence we have in our own capacity is actually a type of foolishness. And we, all the modern people, should think twice that this deceptive modern confidence is actually taking us away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we should come back, depend on Him, ask for forgiveness, and ask for help and support from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's the final destination of us. Then the other type of benefits that actually include that trial and tribulations, those are means by which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually removes sin, right? If anybody goes through a trial and show patience, then his sin will be forgiven, subhanallah. So that's a very big benefit. And anybody who is facing this trial and tribulation in a proper manner with patience, then that will be a great source of reward and the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So now when we have a good time, then the test is actually whether we show shukr to Allah. And when we have a tough time, then the test is actually whether we show patience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now you can think in one way that both are tests and both are equal, even though we always like to be in a good situation rather than in a bad situation. But from the point of view of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, both are equal. But here is an interesting comment by some of our scholars. I'm quoting here from Ibn Razib, that he said a very interesting thing, that the bounty that comes from Allah to a believer due to his trials is greater than the bounty that comes from Allah during his times of ease. So this actually mean that if somebody is in a good shape and showing shukr to Allah, the amount of rahmah and bounty he get from that is not as much as that you actually can earn when you are in a trial and you show patience. So from that point of view, being in trial and showing patience should be the better sources, right? However, this is not to justify asking for trial. We never do that. That's not the sunnah. But rather than if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself put us in trial, then we should not be sorry. We should not panic. Rather than we should take that as a source of bounty and tackle that in the proper manner that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has prescribed for us through his Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Okay, so that's our discussion about the trial and punishment and how to distinguish between them, and what should be our approach when the times of trial comes. Okay, so now I'll go through second point. That's the concept of infectious disease. And there was some of the disease even the time of Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam that was very infectious. For example, plague. And Islam has a very distinctive, very distinct rules about that. So the first, I'll go through a hadith. Excuse me. This hadith is a little bit confusing, but I'll explain. I mean, when we will get the explanation, then it will make sense. There's a hadith in Sahih Muslim, and in that hadith, the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that there is no infectious disease. I believe some of you have heard this from many different sources. And if you just read these hadith from just the plain text and just quote unquote this part, what I'm saying, then there might be a confusion that does it mean that no disease is infectious in nature and we should not care about that at all and we should not show any precaution. However, if we look into other hadith, then we find out that that was not the case. So there is an hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari by Abu Hurairah radhiyallahu anhu where he quoted Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "Do not mix the sick animals with the healthy ones." So the sick animals that's suffering from a disease, and the reason why you do not mix that, because there is a possibility that the healthy one will catch the sickness from the sick animals. So very clearly we understand from this hadith two things. First, the Arab people at that time had an understanding that the disease actually goes from one animal to the other animal, and the other thing is Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam from religious perspective agreed with that, and he gave a ruling that show precaution and do not mix them. So clearly from this hadith we understand that the earlier hadith that's saying that there is no infectious disease should be something else talking about, not actually that how the disease is transmitted, because they had that understanding and we have that in the Sunnah. So now that the second hadith, this is a very famous hadith about plague, and is very relevant to our time to understand what should be the fiqh ruling. Excuse me. Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that when you hear that there is plague in a land, plague was the infectious disease at the time, and there was no cure of it. A lot of people actually died when this type of epidemic plague happened. Do not enter that land. And if the plague befalls a land, you already in it, then do not leave. So Rasulullah is actually saying a concept of quarantine, that if you're already in the land, do not get out of it. And if you're just outside of the land, do not get in. And one of the reasons of this, we understand that if a people get out of that land, he has a possibility that he will cause the infection to somebody else. And if somebody is already outside and if he come in, then he create the possibility that he will catch the disease. So both of these is actually haram in there. So this hadith is also giving us the impression that the nature of the infectious disease and the precaution that's part of our Sharia. So now the question is, what happens in the first hadith where Rasulullah said there is no infectious disease? So this hadith is actually a philosophical understanding. And there is another hadith, here is the text from Sahih al-Bukhari, and this is actually a consequence of that hadith. When Rasulullah said that there is no infectious disease, then a desert Arab asked him a question that, Ya Rasulullah, then what about my camels? They are like deers on the sand, that means they are very healthy. But when a mangy camel comes, so this is a camel which has some kind of skin disease, this comes and mixes with them, it infects them with mange. So all of my camels get infected with that disease. Then Rasulullah replied with a very powerful philosophical question that who infected the first one? So that now explain a lot of things, that Rasulullah actually was not talking about the methods by which it propagates. Rather than he was talking about that why at the very beginning it exists and why it propagates. And that is the reason because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created that in such a way. So he actually talking this that even though there is an infectious disease, but actually it is not without the degree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's not without the wish and will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's why we should take the precaution, but at the same time, we should depend on Allah. So that's the one thing. The second thing he's also talking about, that even though a disease is transmitted from a sick person to a healthy person, but there is always a probability. The probability whether you're going close to a sick person, the probability that your body is growing some antibody and that's fighting with that, each and everybody will not catch the infection. So there is always have a probability. And when you have a probability, there is an uncertainty, and that uncertainty actually saying you that this is not always one-to-one corresponding. So despite of the fact that this hadith has a philosophical understanding, but the previous two hadiths actually talking about that what should be our proactive measures when we have this type of problems. And let's back into the hadith of plague. So it's actually very straightforwardly saying that our course of actions should be do not leave that land and do not enter the land. Now, do not leave that land may have two motivations. One, that if you're already in there, then it's your taqdeer that whatever will happen to you, and you should not run away to escape from the taqdeer of Allah. But that explanation has a limitation. That limitation that you cannot apply that same explanation to the second rule, that do not enter. Because if I think that everything is taqdeer of Allah and my action does not have any consequence, then I can enter into that land. There should not be any problem in that. But entering into the land is equally prohibited of leaving of the land, like the leaving of the land. So that actually means both of this ruling is relevant to prevent it from spreading, and also to prevent creating harm to yourself too. Because if I enter, that I create a probability of harming myself. So that's also haram in here. And if I get out of the land, then I actually creating the probability of harming other people. So in both way, this is haram. So these rules is actually related to two things. One, that the disease has an infectious nature, and the second, that this is creating the probability of harming myself or harming other people. And causing harm is haram in Islam. And there is, excuse me, there is a hadith, it's a very famous hadith that has been used in fiqh literature for a long time to deduce a lot of rules from there. The hadith is actually saying that do not cause harm or return harm. So it's not permissible to make harms to somebody else. So now this hadith has a lot of explanation that under which circumstances you cannot create harm, and under which circumstances you actually can create harm. So there is a very delicate explanation in the fiqh literature. I'll not go into that. But one of the ruling that when a person is going to do something that's causing a general public harm, that the harm you're causing is not specific to one single person rather than this is a specific to a community, to a general public harm. Then the Hanafi position is that this hadith will be applied in its most general sense, and no one is allowed to cause such public harm, even if that harm is not of a great nature. So everybody agrees with the Hanafi school. Even the other school has very, very similar ruling. So now this is the this is a very important rule that we should be very careful at this time. And one important thing is when there is a high probability of causing harm, then we should not use taqdeer to make an excuse. I'm giving an example. Let's say that you're driving and you're driving recklessly with a very high speed, and you cause a accident and somebody is harmed there. And now we are making a statement that that person is in problem because that was his taqdeer. I did not do anything. I just drive the way I liked. So this is not a right statement. I mean, this way nobody actually understood taqdeer within Islam. Rather than this will be understood that your reckless driving had a high probability of causing harm, and that's why it's haram. Doesn't matter how we explain taqdeer in there. We just use taqdeer in a positive sense, that let's say that I'm driving very safely, carefully. Despite of that, I'm in trouble of an accident. And now I convince myself, it's okay, this is taqdeer, this is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and I should show patience. So that's the positive role of taqdeer. We never use taqdeer in a negative way to excuse our reckless behavior. So this is the most important thing, that we should combine taqdeer with preventive action and precaution. And there is a very famous hadith where the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that you tie your camel and then trust in Allah. Because an Arab man was asking Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Ya Rasulullah, can I just leave my camel and then trust in Allah that it will be in there and will not go anywhere else? Then Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, no, don't do that, tie her and then trust in Allah. So that's the sunnah. We do the precaution, we take the actions, and then we trust in Allah. Now, let's put everything into how the present day, all the world nations actually taking precaution to stop the transfer of the disease of others. Here is a curve that they use, and here's the term they use a lot, the flattening the curve. So this curve actually shows the y-axis is the number of cases and the x-axis is the time since you get the first case. So the left-hand curve showing that if you do not take any protective measures, so this is the way how the number of cases will increase. And the right-hand curve actually shows that if you take a protective measure, then the total number of cases will go this way. So this right-hand curve is much more flat than the left-hand curve. And this horizontal dotted line is actually showing the healthcare system capacity. So if you take a precaution, then two things happen. Number one, the curve goes down, so the total number of cases goes down in here. And the second one, that you actually get that number of cases in a much longer time compared to the first cases. So then you have the time to prepare your healthcare system, and you do not get a lot of patients at the same time, and that's why you can provide them the medical support. Now, if you do not take any protective measure and you have the flooding of the patient within a very short time, then the total healthcare system will collapse. And that is happening now in New York City. They have the problem, and in many other cities in the world. So now if we apply all of the fiqh principles that we were discussing before into here, that any actions, any collective actions that actually moving this right-hand curve to the left-hand curve and creating a very big problem on the healthcare system with a short time and leave a lot of people without proper treatment and the possibility of death, so that's actually a high probability of creating public harm. And you can't do that. That can't be jaiz at all. This is just haram. If this understanding of the flattening of the curve has any merit, then any action that actually moving this right-hand curve to the left-hand curve, so that will be a problem in Islam. So we should be very careful of that. Now, if we do not understand the relationship, how this possibility of the harm and the taqdeer should be dealt in a coherent manner, then we will end up into a different situation. But if you deal them perfectly and we understand the correlation, then actually a careful step that will prevent us to create such a very big public harm is something that is very preferable in Islam. So that's the bottom line, that not following the social distancing policy that may cause a serious harm to a large number of people. And that is the base why our ulama should motivate people that not following this social distancing policy should be considered haram in our deen, because that's creating a serious harm to a very large number of people. So we should be very careful about that. So now, even the limit, we can, right, it's permissible to postpone the regular prayers in the mosque, even including the Friday prayer. I know there is a lot of sensitivity about that, but there is a formal fatwa from Al-Azhar that they actually permitted this when they actually weighed at all the possibilities, and they ended up that yes, it's permissible to postpone the regular prayers in mosque and including the Friday prayer. Now, there should be some limitation. Let's say that you can take a excuse me, you can take a calculated risk for limited number of people when there is really emergency and you need it. So, for example, now a lot of healthcare professionals have to do risky duties, and if we use this hadith the same way that you have the possibility of being harmed yourself and you should not do that, so that will not be applied the same way. Rather than the other rule will be applied, that when you have the possibility of a higher harm, you can accept a lower harm, and we will use taqdeer in the positive roles. So we will trust in taqdeer in that way. I'm a healthcare professional, I take precautions as much as I can, and then I have to serve people, and okay, I'll serve people. Now, if there is a possibility that sometimes I catch it, I will consider that as a taqdeer and will trust in Allah. So that's the positive use of the taqdeer. So, for example, that let not do a lot of panic buying and store a lot of goods and food at home, because if you do that, right, you're creating unnecessary problems for other people, and that will create the public harm. So we should be careful of that. So just take some food for a couple of weeks or a month at best, and just trust in Allah that everything will be good. And if you find out that sometimes your friends, family and neighbors are sick, and they are not getting the help from the system the way they should get, and if there is a crisis, and if it is, right, the unavoidable help they need in a tough situation, then we should go ahead to help. Right? In that case, we need to take the risk. So now, if I look into some of the scenarios in Bangladesh and other countries, it looks like that some people are not getting the basic treatments, some are not getting the basic burial. So a Muslim society should not go there. Right? A Muslim society should not go there. Will not create unrestricted problems for others, but when we have to take a calculated risk, we have to take it. And for example, right, we know the statistics that the young people who doesn't have a medical history is not a very big danger in this situation. So they can take risk. They can go ahead, help somebody, and then just take the quarantine for 14 days so that they do not spread this disease to somebody else. So that is one way to solve excuse me, that problem. So if someone is sick, we should be careful that the disease is not spreading, but at the same time we should be compassionate. Right? We should be compassionate. In Islam, we always have certain values. We always have certain duties that has more weightage than my personal comfort zone. That has more weightage even my life. Right? If at some point we have to take risk on our life, we have to take it. So it's not that we close all the doors being afraid of the harm. Rather than we take a weightage, what's the bigger harm, how we can stop that, and what's the small harm. Sometimes we need to take risk on that so that we can prevent the bigger harm. So we should not behave in a way that is reckless. At the same time, we should not behave in a way that is extremely personal benefit oriented. Rather than we always orient our our understanding and our action that actually serves most of the people in the society. And we'll use taqdeer when it needs in the positive roles. We'll trust in Allah in there. But when it comes the questions of the precaution, we'll not use taqdeer as an excuse. Okay, so and finally, when we are done doing all of this, whatever in our human capacity, then we'll seek forgiveness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for our sins and limitations, and we'll pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for his help and protection, and let us trust on only him. And that's the end, right? Allah said to Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, even fasabbih bihamdi rabbika astaghfir innahu kana tawwaba. So we'll do the hamd of Allah, we'll seek the forgiveness from him, and of course Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgive us. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept our tawbah, and he is the only hope for us. And we pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala so that he help us in this tough time, and he forgives our sin, and remove this musibah and this pandemic from us. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala help us all. So I'll end here, and if you have any question, then I'll try to answer. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم.